There is a version of you that exists purely on paper, a version made entirely of numbers on an application form, and long before a landlord ever meets the real you. That paper version has already decided how you will be treated, how quickly your calls get returned, and whether you are seen as a tenant worth keeping or a risk worth avoiding. This is the story of 5 different incomes, 5 different lives, and one identical apartment building, and what happens to each of them reveals something far larger than housing. It reveals exactly how trust, risk, actually move through the modern economy, quietly, invisibly, and almost never in the direction fairness would predict. Let's start at the bottom of this ladder, with an income of $30,000 a year, because this is where the machinery of the system reveals itself most bluntly. At this income level, finding housing is not simply a matter of preference. It is a mathematical battle fought against a rule most renters have heard of, but rarely understand the origin of. The idea that rent should never exceed roughly a third of gross income. This rule did not emerge from thin air. It traces to housing policy decisions made decades ago, adopted so widely across the rental industry that it eventually calcified into an unquestioned standard, even though the economic reality behind it has shifted dramatically since it was first established. For someone earning $30,000 annually, this rule effectively caps acceptable at a level in a large number of major cities today simply does not correspond to any available housing at all. The math itself becomes the rejection letter long before a landlord ever reads a name or reviews an application. Watch what happens next, because this is where the story becomes genuinely revealing. Denied by the math, this renter is pushed toward a smaller, more limited pool of available units, and within that smaller pool, landlords hold disproportionate leverage, precisely because desperation compresses choice. A security deposit that might be negotiable for a wealthier applicant becomes non-negotiable here. A minor blemish on a credit report, the kind a higher income applicant could simply explain away in conversation, becomes an automatic disqualifier processed by software that never hears an explanation at all. This is not cruelty for its own sake, an understanding that distinction matters enormously. It is risk management, cold and mechanical, operating exactly as it was designed to operate. And the tragic irony sitting underneath it is that this same risk management process frequently lower income renters toward the exact outcomes it claims to be protecting against: unstable housing, predatory terms, and landlords who specialize specifically in extracting maximum value from tenants with the least available leverage to push back. This pattern has a name in economic circles, though it is rarely applied to housing in everyday conversation: the poverty premium, the well-documented phenomenon in which having less money causes nearly everything to cost proportionally more. It shows up in interest rates on loans, in insurance premiums, in the fees attached to basic financial services, and housing is one of its most visible, most consequential expressions. The renter earning $30,000 is not simply paying more of their income toward housing than a wealthier renter. They are frequently paying a genuinely higher effective price for comparable or even inferior housing, once you account for hidden fees, higher security deposits relative to income, and the absence of any real negotiating position. Now move up the ladder to $50,000 a year, and something subtle but important begins shifting, not dramatically, but enough to notice if you are paying attention. This income level sits in a strange middle zone, high enough to clear some of the harshest automatic disqualifications, low enough to still be treated with visible caution. Landlords at this level frequently request additional documentation, proof of consistent employment history, sometimes a co-signer, sometimes several months of rent paid up front as reassurance. None of these requests are unresolation, but stacked together, they reveal something important about how trust functions in the modern economy. It is rarely given freely, it is extracted through friction, and the amount of friction required to prove yourself trustworthy decreases steadily as your income rises, regardless of whether your actual character or reliability as a tenant has changed at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it exposes an uncomfortable truth about how modern financial systems actually function beneath their polished, procedural surface. Trust, in theory, should be earned through demonstrated behavior, paying rent on time, maintaining a property responsibly, being a reasonable person to deal with. In practice, trust is frequently assigned in advance, based almost entirely on income, before any actual behavior has been demonstrated at all. The $50,000 earner and the $30,000 earner might be, in terms of genuine reliability and character, completely indistinguishable from each other, yet the system extends meaningfully different levels of presumed trust to each of them, purely as a function of a number on a pay stub. Climb further to $100,000 annually, and the entire emotional texture of the interaction shifts noticeably. Applications, faster. Fewer questions get asked. The tone of communication, subtle but unmistakable, shifts from suspicion toward something closer to accommodation. This is the income level. Typically stop viewing the applicant to be managed and start viewing them as a customer to be retained. And that shift in framing changes everything about the texture of the relationship that follows. Maintenance requests get handled more promptly, not necessarily because the landlord has become more generous as a person, but because the perceived cost of losing a reliable, higher-income tenant now outweighs the minor inconvenience of addressing their concerns quickly. Here is where market psychology becomes genuinely important to understand, because this shift is not arbitrary. It reflects a real, calculated risk assessment happening on the landlord's side, whether consciously articulated or simply absorbed through years of experience. A tenant earning $100,000 represents, statistically, a meaningfully lower probability of missed rent, of costly eviction proceedings, of the kind of prolonged vacancy and legal expense that erodes a landlord's actual profitability far more than a slightly higher maintenance ever could. Landlords, whether they think of themselves or not, are functioning as risk underwriters, constantly running an informal probability calculation on every applicant, and income serves as the single most convenient, most heavily weighted variable in that calculation, regardless of how imperfectly it actually predicts individual behavior. Push higher still to $500,000 annually, and the relationship transforms again, this time in a way that reveals something genuinely fascinating about how power redistributes itself once risk essentially disappears from the equation. At this income level, the landlord is no longer primarily assessing whether this tenant can pay. That question has been effectively answered before the conversation even begins. The dynamic shifts instead toward retention and accommodation, the landlord now actively working to make the tenant comfortable enough to stay, extend their lease, and avoid the disruption and lost income that comes with turnover. Renovation requests that would have been flatly denied at lower income levels become negotiable. Lease terms that once favored the landlord exclusively begin bending, at least modestly, toward the tenant's preferences. This is the exact inversion point worth pausing on, because it captures something essential about how leverage actually works throughout the broader economy, not just in housing. Below a certain threshold, the person with less money holds essentially no negotiating power, because scarcity of options, not lack of assertiveness, determines outcomes. Above a certain threshold, the dynamic doesn't simply become more equal, it can actually invert, with the party holding capital effectively gaining leverage over the party who previously held all the structural power, precisely because that capital represents something the landlord now has meaningful incentive to retain and protect. Now reach the top of this ladder, an income of $1 million annually, and the entire framework the previous 4 tiers operated within essentially dissolves and gets replaced by something categorically different. At this level, are not applying for rental housing through the same channels at all. The entire transaction shifts toward private arrangements, direct relationships with property owners or specialized agents, sometimes bypassing formal applications entirely in favor of conversations built on reputation and existing networks. The rules that governed every previous income bracket, income-to-rent ratios, credit checks, security deposits calculated as a multiple of monthly rent, become almost irrelevant, replaced by an entirely different currency, reputation, existing relationships, and the landlord's own calculation of prestige associated with securing a high-profile or high-net-worth tenant. This transformation deserves genuine economic examination because it illustrates a pattern that extends far beyond housing into nearly every corner of the financial system. The way formal rules and procedures exist primarily to manage risk and uncertainty, and the way those same rules become almost entirely optional once risk and uncertainty have been effectively eliminated. The credit check exists to predict the likelihood of missed payments. At $1 million income, that likelihood approaches statistical irrelevance, so the credit check itself becomes a formality rather than a genuine gatekeeping mechanism. The security deposit exists to protect against potential property damage or unpaid rent. At this income level, that protection becomes almost symbolic, a legal formality rather than a genuine financial safeguard, because the actual risk it was designed to mitigate has effectively disappeared. Step back now and look at these 5 tiers together, because the pattern connecting them reveals something considerably larger than housing policy. It reveals the fundamental logic underlying nearly every financial relationship in a modern capitalist economy. Systems built around risk management, whether in housing, lending, insurance, or investment, do not actually treat people according to their character, their reliability, or their inherent worth as human beings. They treat people according to statistical probability, calculated primarily, sometimes almost exclusively, through the proxy of income and wealth. This is not a moral failing unique to landlords. It is the predictable output of a system optimized for minimizing financial risk at scale, a system that necessarily treats individual humans as data points representing aggregate probability rather than as unique, complex people deserving individualized consideration. This pattern connects directly to something much larger happening throughout the global economy, worth understanding not as an abstract parallel, but as literally the same underlying mechanism operating at a different scale. Consider how international credit markets treat nations during periods of economic stress. Wealthy, economically stable countries facing temporary difficulty can typically borrow at favorable rates almost immediately because global capital markets assess their risk of default as low, based on historical economic strength rather than the specific circumstances of the current crisis. Developing nations facing comparable, sometimes objectively less severe difficulty, frequently face dramatically higher borrowing costs, sometimes losing access to international capital markets entirely at precisely the moment they need support the most. This is not a coincidence or an isolated policy failure. It is the exact same risk determining how our $30,000 renter and our $1 million renter get treated, simply operating at the scale of entire national economies rather than individual apartment applications. This connects, in turn, to one of the more uncomfortable truths in modern macroeconomics, the way inflation and monetary policy, with this exact same risk hierarchy, often reinforcing it rather than correcting it. When governments manage substantial debt loads through gradual currency valuation, a strategy history shows nations consistently favor over the more politically painful alternatives of aggressive taxation or spending cuts. The resulting inflation does not affect all income levels equally. Renters and workers whose income comes primarily from wages experience inflation directly and immediately, watching the real value of their earnings, while rent, groceries, and basic necessities become steadily more expensive. Those whose wealth in appreciating assets, real estate, equity ownership, diversified investment portfolios, frequently see the nominal value of those assets rise alongside or even faster than itself, meaning the exact same economic policy that quietly security for our lower income renters simultaneously protects and often enhances the financial position of the landlords and property owners sitting at the top of this same housing hierarchy. This is precisely why housing, more than almost any other everyday financial relationship, functions as such a clear, visible window into the broader mechanics of wealth inequality. The apartment building in this story is not simply providing shelter. It is functioning as a compressed, physical representation of how risk, trust, and capital move through an entire economic system, visible in a way that stock portfolios and bond markets, operating largely out of public view, rarely are. Everyone has, at some point, filled out a rental application, and everyone who has done so has experienced, whether they fully recognized it at the time or not, a direct encounter with this exact same risk-based sorting mechanism that shapes far larger financial systems. Never think to examine this closely. Given all of this, it becomes reasonable to ask whether any of it can actually change, whether this pattern of risk-based sorting is simply an unavoidable, permanent feature of how capitalist economies allocate housing and resources, or whether history offers any genuine examples of this dynamic shifting meaningfully over time. The honest answer is nuanced. Housing policy has, at various points throughout modern history, attempted to interrupt this pattern directly through rent stabilization measures, through anti-discrimination protections, targeting income-based sorting when it overlaps with other protected characteristics, through public and subsidized housing designed explicitly to remove market-based risk calculations from a portion of available housing entirely. These interventions have produced genuinely mixed results, sometimes succeeding in creating meaningful stability for lower-income renters, sometimes producing unintended consequences that reduced overall housing supply or shift risk-based sorting into less visible, harder to regulate corners of the market. What history demonstrates more consistently, though, is that individual understanding of this system, even without structural policy change, meaningfully alters outcomes for people navigating it. Renters who understand precisely how the rent ratio calculation works, who understand which specific documentation genuinely reduces perceived risk in a landlord's eyes, who understand the difference based on genuine risk assessment and a rejection based on unlawful discrimination masquerading as risk assessment, consistently navigate this system with measurably better outcomes than renters encountering these same mechanisms blind, discovering the rules only through repeated, often demoralizing rejection. This brings the story to its final, uncomfortable turn, the recognition that this entire pattern, playing out identically across 5 income tiers in a single apartment building, is simply a smaller, more visible version of trust and capital move through every corner of the modern financial system, from personal lending to international sovereign debt markets. The $30,000 renter facing skepticism and friction at every step is experiencing, in miniature, precisely what developing economies experience when seeking international capital during moments of crisis. The million-dollar earner moving to an entirely different, frictionless set of informal rules is experiencing, in miniature, precisely what wealthy nations experience when markets extend them confidence and favorable terms almost automatically, based on historical strength rather than any specific current circumstance. So here is the question this story ultimately leaves behind, considerably more unsettling than a simple observation about landlords treating rich and poor tenants differently. It is whether the number attached to your name, your income, your net worth, has been quietly doing more to shape how the world responds to you than your actual character, your actual reliability, or your actual behavior ever has, and whether under this mechanism clearly, rather than experiencing it repeatedly without ever naming it, is itself one of the most practical pieces of financial education available to anyone navigating a system that was never designed to explain its own rules honestly in the first place.